Well, excellent. It is noon. Thank you everyone for joining us today. This is our second webinar, and this is Star Trek Elimination of Bias. This is still CLE pending. If it is approved, we will be sure to send the confirmation and the record of attendance and all other supporting documents for you. We'll also have a survey come up at the end for how you like the presentation. My name is Joshua Gilliland. I'm one of the founding attorneys on the Legal Geeks. Our panel today includes several good friends of mine. So we have Steve Chu, who is an assistant U.S. attorney in San Diego. Steve is appearing in his personal capacity because the federal government does not have any federal views on Star Trek. And Angela Story, who is with the Hartford, who is also appearing in her personal capacity. Both are lifelong Star Trek fans, fantastic attorneys, and we're going to break down many of the great issues from Star Trek and Elimination of Bias. We'll take questions at the end. You can use the chat feature if you have a question that's immediate, but there's also a Q&A option as well. In addition, we put in a couple fun polls. So we can do multiple presentations on Elimination of Bias from Star Trek. So we picked a handful of episodes to discuss, and we can revisit this because there are plenty of episodes that address elimination of bias. Let's jump over to one of the big ones from Court Martial, which aired in 1967, and it hits diversity in the practice of law. And Angie, would you like to talk about how forward-thinking this episode was?
Sure. So this episode was aired in 1966, at which time I think you had about 3% of lawyers were women. If they got legal secretary jobs, that was considered great. Our judiciary was almost entirely male. This episode was really progressive for its time. If you look at the four judges, 3 out of 4 appear to be people of color. And in fact, in the United States, the first federal appellate judge of South Asian descent wasn't appointed until 2013. So to have this kind of diversity in 1966 was very forward thinking for Star Trek.
In addition to the fact that we do have a female attorney, and we'll talk about her in just a moment as well.
Yes.
Steve, let's pivot over to Measure of a Man for the discussion of what can Mr. Data teach us about equal protection from his status as an android.
Right, so Measure of a Man is one of the early Star Trek Next Generation episodes, one of the first ones in which we see an actual formal legal proceeding. The setup is very interesting and really goes to the questions of what does it mean to be alive? Is Data a person or not? Data, of course, is an artificial life form, is the term he prefers. He is an android constructed by who we believe to be the late Dr. Noonien Soong, who makes a breakthrough with a positronic brain, constructs Data. And in some of the role-playing games, the FASA role-playing games, there is some discussion about the controversy that arises when Data even wants to join Starfleet, and there's a big debate that goes forward at that point. Data at some point joins Starfleet, rises to the rank of lieutenant commander. The premise of this episode is that a Starfleet scientist approaches Data and says, I want to learn how you work so that I can replicate you. And in order to do so, I need to shut you down and basically tear you apart, dissect you in a way. And of course, I will reconstruct you and you will be fine. Data refuses. And at some point, the scientist says, well, we can order you. You are part of Starfleet. And Data then resigns. The scientist, undeterred, goes a step further and says, you cannot resign. You don't have that right. You are, in fact, Starfleet property rather than a person. This then prompts the judicial proceeding. It is at a sort of frontier outpost, if you will. The JAG is the only attorney on the station. So Captain Picard assumes the defense of Data, arguing that he is, in fact, a person. And Will Riker then represents the scientist against his wishes. Interesting issues raised here. We can't go into it too much in depth, but applying this to sort of our system of laws, really this implicates the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, which provides that nor shall any state deny to any person within its jurisdiction equal protection of the laws. So then the question is data a person or is he property? Very powerful arguments are made on both sides. But ultimately, Captain Picard argues not only that he fulfills some of the tests of sentience, that he can think, that he can feel, is he a person in that sense, but also Picard makes a sort of corollary argument that what we're talking about if we allow this to go forward is we would be talking about a form of slavery, creating an entire race of artificial life forms to do our bidding. So the episode really hammers home these questions of equal protection and ultimately rules in favor of data, that he is a person.
Thank you. Let's look at one of the other issues that's heavily tied to this issue from representation and elimination of bias, and that's Star Trek's positive depiction of women in the practice of law. And Angela, could you help us go over the number of percentage of attorneys who were practicing at the time of the different trial episodes of Star Trek and where we are today?
Right. So in 1966, when we had court-martial, about 3% of lawyers were women. And a survey done in 1963 for about 430 law firms found that being female was the characteristic that got the most negative rating when determining whether or not to select new recruits to the law firm. So in court-martial, we've got a prosecutor who is a woman. Her ethics violations are an entirely, that's its own seminar, but that was pretty progressive for 1966 when Sandra Day O'Connor graduated third in her class at Stanford. The only job she was offered was a legal secretary. But yet Star Trek, has a woman as a female prosecutor. Slowly, you can see over the years, the number of women practicing law has increased, and Star Trek has had a number of women lawyers. Right now, we've got about 38% of practicing lawyers being female. However, our law school students are about 51%. So there's an issue with women who are going to law school but aren't staying in the practice of law. And there are a number of reasons for that, but unconscious bias, kind of exclusion from networks and client development is a huge factor for women. And at the top ranked law schools, their percentage of women at those law schools is actually less than 50%, with the exception of Berkeley, which has a record-breaking 60% of their law school students being women. Women lawyers are more likely to work for the government as opposed to private firms. And we still make 76% less compared to men for the same job. So there is a lot of work to be done on that front.
Thank you, Angela. And for the bonus round, for those who are curious, the first legal job that Sandra Day O'Connor was hired for was at the District Attorney's Office for San Mateo County. So let's pivot over to balance of terror. And Steve, could you help us understand the hostile work environment and racial discrimination that Spock endures in this episode?
So Balance of Terror, original series episode where we learn about the Romulan Star Empire. And in that episode, we learned that the Romulans, who are sort of mentioned but not discussed very much, they're a mysterious race that no Federation person has come physically in contact or in person-to-person contact with the Romulans, so no one knows what they look like. We have our beloved Mr. Spock, a Vulcan, pointy-eared, intelligent beacon of logic, as the science officer and first officer on board the Enterprise. And during the course of the episode, we learn upon viewing a Romulan bridge that the Romulans are in fact very similar in appearance to Vulcans. And we learn later that they're actually an offshoot and some sort of distant cousins from a common ancestor. This prompts then Lieutenant Stiles, who is on the bridge of the Enterprise, to begin reacting very negatively to Mr. Spock, because Lieutenant Stiles lost some family members in the prior war between the Federation and the Romulan Star Empire. So let's talk about hostile work environment. Does that create a hostile work environment? What we are talking about here is Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Title VII prohibits employers from discriminating against employees on the basis of sex, race, color, national origin, and religion. So those are what are known as protected classes. If a person falls into a protected class and then is discriminated against due to their membership in that class, that would violate Title VII, can result in a civil lawsuit, can result in damages. There are many administrative remedies that are available before actually reaching federal court that, none of which we really need to get into at this point. However, it's worth pointing out that at this point, if Spock were to pursue such a claim, he would essentially be suing the Federation for saying, look, you're allowing a hostile work environment. It's not clear that the Federation command, certainly Captain Kirk, who's a good friend of his, is not discriminating against Spock. However, hostile work environment captures the notion that even if the employer doesn't directly target somebody, if they allow things to happen that creates an intolerable workplace, that can also be an avenue that the plaintiff can proceed in, pursue in trying to pin liability upon the employer. Ultimately, although Stiles questions Spock's loyalty, he is proven, of course, to be incorrect, and Spock is a very loyal, proven to be a loyal, dedicated Starfleet officer. But it's an interesting way to confront the issue of, well, is discrimination gone even in the 23rd century at that point?
It's worth noting two things. One, Kirk directly addressed Stiles when, about his bigotry and says, leave your bigotry in your quarters. There's no place for it on the bridge, which is good. So from a management perspective. And secondly, showing the positive aspect of Star Trek, Stiles does have a redemption, realizing, oh, despite me being a jerk, Spock still saves him, and he's very, very grateful for that and recognizes the error of his ways. For context, here's the California definition of racial discrimination, which basically is very broad. We articulate all the things that we do not want people to be discriminated against, because that's not in our value system, and the code's there. Let's go to the next generation. And Angela, could you please help us with the outcast? And we can get into it a little bit more.
All right, so this was an incredibly impactful episode. This is one where the Enterprise goes to a planet inhabited by the Janai. The Janai don't have gender. And as Riker is working with one of the Janai named Soren, she tells him that, in fact, there are individuals in the Janai society that do identify either as male or female, but that they are considered to be sick or deviant or in need of being cured. So they remain in hiding, seeking out others who also have identify with male or female. This episode aired in 1992, and right about then we were just starting to have a discussion about gay rights, gender identity, and sexual orientation, and this actually aired just a little bit before Don't Ask, Don't Tell was put forth as a progressive idea, sarcasm included there. So, Star Trek really wanted to make a point, and they did it in a really unique way by flipping it on its head and saying, all right, so we've got a race that has no gender, and somebody identifies as female, and they're being told that that's bad. and using the analogy to what was going on in society at the time. And Rick Berman did a couple of interviews about this episode where he said that he didn't want to let public perception influence what Star Trek was trying to get across. However, the issue as to whether or not to cast Soren with a male or female actor was an issue. And he felt that if they were to cast Soren with a male actor, with Riker having a love interest and kissing her, that would actually be completely unpalatable to the viewers. And so they chose to go with a female actor for that character. And that was something that actually Jonathan Frakes later criticized. He felt that the episode would have been much more powerful had Soren been cast with a male actor. And I love this episode. I've always, though, had some issues with the ending. Soren is eventually found out by her people and is forced to undergo what is essentially conversion therapy. And they do that to her before Riker is able to rescue her. And my issue with the ending is she comes out and she's happy and content. And I've always felt like they could have found a better ending to this episode. And but for its time, it was very powerful. It received a lot of criticism. Some actually thinking that Star Trek didn't go far enough in advancing gay rights. So now in California, we've got a statute that allows a person to identify their gender regardless of their appearance, their legal sex, or the sex that they were assigned at birth. And there is a process for a person to go to the courts and change their name to conform with their own gender identity, regardless of what's on their birth certificate. So California has been pretty progressive about this. And I think one thing as lawyers that is becoming an issue, and it should be an issue that we need to address, is making sure that we are talking to our clients and our opposing counsels and our witnesses with the pronouns that they prefer. And if you don't know what that pronoun is that they prefer, then ask. And then make sure that you actually use the pronoun that they prefer. I mean, that's kind of just one way to respect our clients and respect the people that we're dealing with in the courts.
Thank you, Angela. Well, let's pivot over to my favorite series, which is Deep Space Nine. In the episode Captive Pursuit, we have a craft that comes through from the Gamma Quadrant. The being on board is named Tosk, and O'Brien befriends him. He is very coy in describing who he is and what happened to him other than I am Tosk. Well, as we learn, his entire species is hunted for sport by the other species that discriminates against them from their home world. And it's a very uncomfortable realization because the other aliens come and say, hey, we want him back. The fact he was captured alive is a disgrace. And Cisco says, like, yeah, we have to give him back, but no one's happy with it. And Miles O'Brien does I'm going to ignore orders and break him out and help him escape, which is kind of the normal reaction most of us would have to that, because slavery is illegal. We don't have indentured servitude. We fought a civil war over this. So when confronted with a culture that would have a form of slavery and hunt people for sport, the reaction to be, disgusted and say like, no, I'm not on board with this. I don't have to respect this because it's an abomination. Miles acts in a very human way that follows the tradition of the Federation. Now, with the issue of not following orders coming in, that's a separate discussion. But Cisco tells Odo to take his time in stopping O'Brien, realizing that, I don't like this either, and I can't give the chief a free pass, but we can basically let it slide. Now, California's Constitution in Article 1, Section 31, declares in our laws in the state of California that we should not discriminate against or give preferential treatment to anyone on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, national origin, in the operation of public employment, public education, or public contracting. And then we have the other laws we've mentioned as well. So we are very much on the forward edge as a state in applying our principles. Now, this raises an interesting question with Tosk. If he could have asked for asylum, and the question of, does Tosk have a well-founded fear of persecution based upon his ethnicity? I would think yes. Now, he doesn't ask for it because of that's not his way, but it's still a very interesting question that if he had asked for asylum, it could have been granted. Now, why don't we pivot over to another cultural question that we'll look at from a religious context, and that's the TNG episode Ethics. Steve?
So this episode airs in 1992. It really grapples with the issue of euthanasia and the right to die, issues that at times are very much in the press. In this particular episode, what happens is Worf, who is a proud Klingon warrior, also the security chief aboard the Enterprise, is involved in an accident whereby he is paralyzed from the neck down. Being paralyzed in the Klingon warrior culture really, prevents Worf from doing many of the things that Klingons hold dear. He would not be able to wage war. He would not be able to participate in hand-to-hand combat or win honor for his house. He then requests Commander Riker to end his life, essentially to kill him or assist him in committing suicide. Riker, in response at that point during the episode, he comments that he can respect Worf's beliefs, but that Worf is asking him to take an active part in his committing suicide. In fact, Worf, under Klingon tradition, would typically be supposed to ask his son, Alexander Rosenko, but he just cannot bear to do that or put that type of burden upon Alexander, and therefore asks Will Riker, who he presumably has a good deal of respect for. Will refuses. The episode, after dealing with these issues, what Worf is faced with in his choice is either continue to live as is, where he can receive some treatment and perhaps regain control of roughly 60% of his body, or undergo a radical new experimental therapy that may restore him to full health, which he does elect to do. At the conclusion of the episode, it appears that we've lost Worf, that the procedure has not worked. However, miraculously, he sort of regenerates and he's fine. So we sort of get that happy ending while also confronting this powerful social issue, which Star Trek does very well. Now, if we look at sort of real world laws, in 1994, Oregon was the first to pass a law allowing physician-assisted suicide for the terminally ill. This is one of the first instances. That law is immediately challenged in court, and several physicians are among the plaintiffs because they say, in requiring us to follow this law and assist in people committing suicide, that violates our religious beliefs. So really, we should enjoin the enforcement of this law because we don't want to, on the one hand, professionally, we need to assist our patient, but personally and religiously, it violates our personal religious beliefs. So what do? It's interesting, at the trial court level, the district court, after reviewing this, grants an injunction. And there are some important considerations there about the burden of proof on injunction. You have to show irreparable harm and likelihood of success on the merits. What the court ultimately does there is just the court says that we will essentially push pause and delay the implementation of the law until we can have a better and more full hearing on the constitutional issues. Case ultimately goes up to the Ninth Circuit. The Ninth Circuit says that they don't have jurisdiction to decide. It's not ripe. and the plaintiffs don't have standing, and so essentially the Ninth Circuit leaves the law in place. So there are some, real world. That's sort of how courts have grappled with the issue in the real world, recognizing that we have ethical issues, philosophical and religious issues as well.
And I think in 2018 in California, several doctors filed to stop California's end of life, and the court determined that they didn't have standing because they weren't being forced to do this. Just like Riker wasn't being forced to help Worf, he had a choice not to do it, and the doctors as well have a choice to not help somebody in their life, so they didn't have standing to stop the law.
Yeah, there's also
these can be considered examples of situations where the court is reluctant to wade into very controversial social political issues, believing that perhaps that's better left decided by the legislatures and political debate. Whether you agree or not, that's a position that many courts will take. Sorry, Josh.
Yeah, so there was the issue of Worf not having a terminal illness, and that should be recognized as a talking point. But while we don't exactly have Klingon culture as a religious discussion, this probably could be discussed as a religious issue, whether or not the Religious Freedom Act could play a role here in Worf's wish to end his life. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So there are a couple issues there. One is, as you say, Worf was not in fact suffering from a terminal illness, but he was, in his mind, he was saying, well, I can no longer live my life as a warrior, live my life in the way I choose, and that is a living death for me. The courts, when they examined the Oregon law, they pointed out one of the criticisms leveled against the law was that terminal illnesses can be misdiagnosed. And in that case, what do you do if someone believes they are dying, but they in fact are not dying? Doesn't that change sort of the ethical analysis? And that's one of those difficult issues. There's no right or wrong answer there. That's just one of those difficult questions to to answer. Religious freedom, Worf could certainly bring that, make that argument. His argument would be that our warrior culture is like our religion. It is a belief system that is inherent and very dear to the Klingon culture. If I can no longer follow that belief system, am I not in fact, dead? There is a later episode in Deep Space Nine where Worf has now fallen from grace after refusing to help Gowron, and his brother Kurn just cannot bear to suffer those injustices. And as a result, Worf does what is pretty dramatic and could actually be considered a sort of assisted suicide. He brainwashes his brother Kurn, and Kurn wakes up and doesn't even know who he is anymore, and Worf allows him to lead another life, assume a new identity where he's no longer a member of a disgraced house, so that he can somehow try to find his own way now in the Klingon culture. Some fascinating discussions there.
Indeed, and nice play with Deep Space Nine. So let's pivot over to one of the wonderful issues with Deep Space Nine and Ferengi love songs. So there are two powerful and well executed discrimination issues here. And the first is with Quark's mom, because the way that the Ferengi treat women is appalling. They're not permitted to wear clothes. They're not supposed to leave the house. They're prohibited from learning to read. They're not supposed to earn profit. And Quark's mom does all of those things. And she's a genius at financial investing and making business decisions. And she's an advocate for women's equal rights and eventually falls in love with the Grand Nagus. So that's beautiful. The other half of the story is Rom, who's Quark's brother. He wants to get married to a Bajoran, and the Ferengi have the worst prenuptial agreements that anyone could ever imagine, because the prospective wife would be barred from owning any property herself after signing this agreement and making any claims against the husband's estate in the event the marriage ends. This is horrifying, and Angela, could Why don't we talk about the validity of these type of prenuptial agreements? And just in case there's any doubt here, people think like, ah, that sounds okay to me.
Yes, so I mean, a prenuptial agreement has to be voluntarily signed, and it can't be unconscionable. It's got to be relatively fair to the parties, provided that they've got some sort of equal bargaining power. There has to be full disclosure about who owns what ahead of time, and you have to have, an opportunity to review it. Prenuptial agreements that were given to one party on the church steps have been deemed to be invalid. And I actually have run across this issue, and it was surprising to me. I was dealing with a case where there was a prenuptial agreement that said if the husband divorced the wife or the wife divorced the husband, the wife would get $5,000 and he got everything else and the kids. And I had to explain that's completely unconscionable. There's no court in the state of California that's going to uphold that prenuptial agreement. So, important thing with prenuptials, get them reviewed by an attorney and make sure that there's absolute full disclosure before any party signs. And nor can the state, or the Ferengi in this case, make a law that says that women in particular don't, give up all of their rights. We've come a lot farther than that.
Yeah, I did a blog post about this a while ago and looked at many other states, and I can say with confidence, no state in the union would uphold a Ferengi prenuptial agreement because they're just barbaric. That being said, let's pivot back to another Deep Space Nine episode of Sanctuary, which was the 10th episode from the second season. And the episode begins with a ship with a handful of refugees coming through the wormhole. It takes a while to understand them for the universal translator to actually be able to translate their language. And we learn that there are 3 million of them, and that they come from a culture that was subjugated for 800 years, that the culture that had oppressed them had been overrun by the Dominion, and that this group had escaped and they were looking for the eye of the universe. This small group found it, and they were culturally different. Yes, it was a matriarchy, but which isn't that different, but the fact that they had no concept of marriage, but women took multiple mates. There were things that were different about them culturally, and the fact they wanted to go to Bajor to settle. And Angela, can you help us understand some of the issues of could asylum be sought for the Skorians on Bajor applying our standards of law?
Right. So in the United States, anyone who is physically present within the boundaries of the United States or at a port of entry can claim asylum. They can make that claim. There's a legal process to go through afterwards, but that is, you need to be at a port of entry or within the United States in order to make the claim for asylum. You cannot make your claim for asylum from your home country. You've got to be within the borders of the United States to make that claim. And one of the discussions that we had last night while we were preparing for this was, is Deep Space Nine a port of entry? Is it part of Bajoran territory? I think we decided yes, it's owned by the Bajorans. It's the Bajoran space station. So the Skorians, once they entered Deep Space Nine, could then make a claim for asylum while they were still in the Gamma Quadrant, still on their ships outside Deep Space Nine. They did not have the right to make a claim for asylum, but as soon as they stepped foot onto Deep Space Nine, they could in fact make a claim for asylum.
Let's talk about the burden of proof in making such a claim.
So the burden of proof to make a claim for asylum is on the person seeking asylum. And it's a pretty hard burden of proof. There are a lot of hurdles to go through. You have to establish that you are being prosecuted or may come to some harm because of your race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. And those can be, you have to prove a what's the word that I'm looking for, but that it's a real harm that you're going to face. It's not just something that you're concerned about, but that you are in fact going to be harmed if you are sent back to your country of origin.
Not speculative, an actual threat.
Thank you, yes.
Which you could say the Dominion would be an actual threat. And throw in 800 years of oppression, I think that would tip in their favor.
Right, although in this case, as I recall, the Dominion overran the people that were oppressing them. So the question is, are they being oppressed by the Dominion still? And are they being, is there a credible fear of oppression from the Dominion as opposed to the oppression that they had been suffering prior to the Dominion overrunning them?
That also gets into the additional clause with refugee rights and situations that in our country, the president could declare an emergency that would recognize their right to seek asylum, and being able to say they were oppressed for 800 years. Well, that's not recent, that's 800 years of history. The fact that where they came from had just been overrun, that could be the extenuating circumstance that would be an emergency that would justify that sort of declaration. Let's talk about one of the other issues with the type of potential discrimination that they were starting to face with discriminating against refugees in the employment context.
Right, so we do have 42 USCS 2000, I can't read my screen, E-2, that makes it unlawful for an employer to discriminate against a potential employee or an employee based on their race, color, religion, sex, national origin, or to segregate out applicants in any way based on those factors. And I mean, essentially, you kind of want to have a colorblind, gender-blind hiring process to the extent that you can, because unconscious bias is in all of us. And so as much as you can make it based on an applicant's abilities, you're better off, and you're less likely to be facing any sort of lawsuit for race or gender discrimination or unlawful employment practices.
Thank you. Steve, let's take a look at the Voyager episode, Author, and which raises the question of, can a holographic AI be discriminated against?
So this is one of the episodes towards the end of the run of Voyager. Voyager, of course, being trapped in the Delta Quadrant and trying to make its very, very long journey back to the Alpha Quadrant and Earth. As they get closer, they are able now to have intermittent communication with Earth. The holographic doctor, who is an interesting character, he has written a holo novel whereby he employs the use of many of his shipmates, who he has now modified a little bit, and portrayed them in a very unflattering light. The name of the holo novel, which would be a great trivia question, but I guess I'll just throw it out, is of course Photons Be Free. What happens now is that the doctor, after showing, or his crewmates have seen the novel, they are very upset by it. Because the doctor has now used their likenesses without their consent or permission. He's portraying them in an unflattering light. He is also walking around with this gigantic backpack. And he said this is symbolic of the idea that he, as a hologram, has to face so much inherent discrimination or prejudice that it is that much harder for him to do things and accomplish things than it would be were he an ordinary person, human, alien, what have you. What becomes more interesting then is that his publisher The doctor says, okay, I won't publish this. However, the publisher goes ahead with the publishing schedule and starts disseminating his work. The doctor then tries to stop this, and the publisher says, you do not have the right to do that. And so he goes to a judicial proceeding, a sort of arbitrator, and the doctor argues, well, I am a creator of this work. I can control my creation. The arbitrator rules in an interesting way, and he says ultimately, well, the law, or at least society at this point, is not yet ready to recognize a hologram as a person. However, the holo novel is a creation, and you do have rights as a creator. So you can exercise some control. At that point, of course, the damage is done. The holo novel is being widely circulated, and in fact being circulated among a lot of holograms who are working essentially as servants, workers, slaves, what have you. And they are then saying, hey, take a look at this novel. So interesting questions presented here. We are looking once again at a equal protection type of argument, which would say, that people cannot be treated differently. We also get back to sort of the measure of a man idea of what is a person. Some of those rights have now been extended in Star Trek, the 24th century, to an android. Would Star Trek go even further and extend them to the next level, perhaps to a holographic being? It should be noted too, just within Star Trek canon, that even among holograms, the Doctor is considered unique. Holograms often regenerate, their code is sort of rewritten so that they don't develop any individual personalities. But given that the Voyager is so far from home in the Delta Quadrant, the captain and the crew sort of release the Doctor of a lot of these parameters, and the Doctor is allowed to grow and develop his own personality. So that would certainly bolster his argument that he is in fact an individual. He's different from the other holograms that are out there. Can he be discriminated against? I mean, the Star Trek episode says ultimately no, because he's not a person. That is the hoop he would have to jump through. We have applicable statutes in addition to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. We're looking at the California Government Code, Section 8315, Section 31 of Article 1 of California, which talks about discrimination. The Doctor would have a difficult time proving his case there, given that he's not been recognized as a person. I will also just note in passing, we don't have the time to really go into this too much, but this case, but this episode raises some really interesting issues on intellectual property and misappropriation, and does the person control their likeness?
Thank you. And for the issue of would the Doctor's book create a hostile work environment because he's used their likenesses without their consent and the way he's depicted them, I'm going to go with yes. And with that, let's pivot over to one of the best episodes of Deep Space Nine, Far Beyond the Stars. People might debate this or In the Pale Moonlight is the best episode. That's beyond what we're going to talk about here. But let's break down Sisko's getting visions from the prophets. He's starting to question what's reality because he's starting to think he's a science fiction writer in the late 1950s. And we see all the other actors without their makeup as characters from the 1950s that should make your skin crawl. Because Sisko's character and the women who work at this this magazine are told to sleep in the day of the staff photo because they don't want the readers to know that one of the writers is a woman and that another is an African-American man. And Angela and Steve, let's talk about some of the civil rights issues from this.
I'll jump in for a moment and then turn it over to Angela. But the episode, of course, is set in the 1950s, so this is pre-Civil Rights Act of 64. We're talking about the Jim Crow era. We see, of course, some very powerful and disturbing things happen. As we mentioned earlier, when talking about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, there are 5 protected classes, among them race, gender, So the women who were asked to be absent for the picture, that's certainly a concern there. And then Captain Sisko, who's the author Benny, who writes this story, when the company tells him we will not publish it because you are African American. Obviously, that's a real concern that would seem to run afoul of the Civil Rights Act. Now, what's interesting is if we go a level further, employers typically are allowed to defend their actions if they can provide a non-discriminatory reason for the action that they undertook. As the employer here, they probably would say, well, it's not that we are discriminating, but if the public knew that we were publishing a story by an African-American writer, it just wouldn't sell. So we have a business reason for doing this. Now, in the real world, we've had that come up some. If people remember the novel The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton, she was a woman who wrote about gang violence. And rather than publish her name, she used her initials. And the story, because she was concerned about, well, maybe people wouldn't believe that a woman could write so powerfully and accurately about gangs. And that story went on to become a huge success and was made into a movie. So there could be practical ways to sidestep that. We're sort of jumping several steps ahead in terms of the chess match here. But I'll turn it over to Angela.
It's also important to remember that Benny's story about Captain Sisko was that it was an African-American hero. And that's one of the things they objected to.
Well, and they flat out said, if you change it to a white captain, we'll publish it.
One of the characters in the dream sequence is based upon D.C. Fontana, who was one of the original writers of Star Trek and also on The Next Generation. Angela, could you help us with the gender discrimination issues that this episode addressed?
Right. So, I mean, she was directly told to sleep in the day that they were doing the office party. And I think her statement was something like, God forbid the world find out that CJ, can't remember her last name, is a woman. And this idea that somehow people aren't going to read the story because it's written by a woman or it's written by an African-American. But the fact that they tell her to stay in, and if they're forcing her to use her initials rather than her name, that would be clear discrimination based on gender. If that's her choice, great. But for an employer to say, we don't want people to know you're a woman, so let's use your initials instead, that's a lawsuit waiting to happen.
Let's pivot over to Enterprise. So there's a 3-part arc from the 4th season where we have discrimination of the Sirenites. Now, without too much background, the Sirenites are being targeted as saying that they were terrorists who planted a bomb in the Federation or the Earth Embassy on Vulcan, and eventually an airstrike's ordered on them. So there are many problems with that because the administrator Toval, who was the default leader of the Vulcans, was actually a Romulan agent. That's all complicated. But the fact that use of force targeting pacifists would open up the Vulcan government to civil liability once all of that really came out. Now, while there could be some sovereign immunity issues, when you look at like the Federal Tort Claim Act and being able to phrase this as a 1983 action of, you targeted us because of our religious beliefs, because we were following the true teachings of Surak, and we were the one with the Kashara that actually showed the way that we should be living. Let's go to another issue on Vulcan from Star Trek Discovery. And Angie, can you tell us what happened to Michael Berman in the Vulcan Science Academy?
So Michael was, I think, close to top of her class, should have been accepted to the Vulcan expeditionary group. And they made Sarah choose. And actually what they said was, I will accept one of your not quite Vulcans. So choose between Michael or Spock. And he ultimately chose Spock. One of the things about this episode is, we see the Vulcans, they're supposed to be portrayed as these logical, non-emotional, non-biased individuals, when in fact, culturally, they, in many of these episodes, are incredibly biased against non-Vulcans. You see that starting with the original series all the way kind of through. For such a logical species, they carry with them an incredible amount of bias against anybody that's not Vulcan. But to deny Michael entrance to the Vulcan expeditionary group simply because she's human, and that they are concerned about the integration of humans. I think what they said was, it's an admirable goal, but it must be titrated. We can't do this too fast. It's too much for our culture. It's pure discrimination. You are not going to get governmental immunity for such blatant, obvious discrimination in determining your acceptance into your schools.
Indeed.
Anytime we talk about schools and segregation, it also kind of brings up memories of Brown versus Board of Education. The idea, well, is separate equal as long as you have another school to go to. But the Supreme Court said no. And such a system is inherently unfair. They could say the Vulcan Science Academy and the Vulcans, they could say, well, Michael Burnham can go elsewhere. They're just as good, but are they?
Well, and they said we could get her into Starfleet. Is Starfleet the same as the Vulcan Expeditionary Group? This was clearly something she had worked with, and they even said that by conventional decision parameters, acceptance with honors is her due. But you're human, so.
So with that, we do have some questions that came in, and we want to address those. So let me pull up the chat here so I can see everything. And one of them goes back to Deep Space Nine and the Tosk episode. This is phrased as a statement, but the prohibition of slavery in the context of the DS9 episode has to compete against the Prime Directive. Yes, it does, but the Prime Directive also deals with first contact, and yes, there is the non-interference aspect as well, but it also gets to the fact that Tosk did not ask for asylum and wanting first contact with anyone from the Gamma Quadrant, because this was their first interaction with anyone from the Gamma Quadrant. They made that giant moral compromise to say you can have them back. And I would be glad to defend O'Brien for what he did. But yes, technically you're correct, and that then raises the issue of the necessity defense.
The Prime Directive looms large, over all sort of Star Trek contacts between Starfleet and any culture. It's often portrayed, it's interesting if you look at novelizations in addition to episodes, it's often portrayed as an absolute bar, but in reality, when you see the practice, Starfleet has bent the rules some. I mean, you have to, certainly for first contact, and if people are requesting asylum or assistance, what do you do? And you're often in this gray area. There's no right or wrong. It's more, well, how much can we help? The best, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right?
We have another question about ethics from the ethics episode of how far do we take like suicide for honor? And I would pivot back to what the California law says for assisted suicide specifically on it has to be a terminal disease. Now, loss of honor wouldn't necessarily be a terminal disease. And I don't think the Religious Freedom Act would allow that either.
And the patient has to be the one to take the drugs. The doctor can't inject them with it. And that's kind of a really important part of the law is it's not somebody else doing the euthanasia. It is the patient themselves doing the euthanasia. And that's a huge distinction.
Yeah, and I actually think the new code section that went into effect actually prohibits the doctors, explicitly from administering it. So it's, there's that level.
Those are good points. I mean, especially what Angela's pointing out, that it makes a huge difference that it's the patient that does it. You know, the law cases often turn on minute details, but the writers of that Next Generation episode are able to skirt that issue, as we discussed earlier, by saying that Worf can't move at all. So even if he wanted to, he could not kill himself, and he has to ask somebody else. You know, even more gray area, if he could do it, you know, would he do it?
Another good distinction brought up here between Measure of a Man and Author, and that being that Starfleet had already decided that Data was a sentient being, but the Doctor had not been ruled so. And I do think Steve raised the point on how the Doctor was different in the fact that he had been left on continuously as opposed to just being used for emergency purposes. Yes, nice question here that highlights how we can do more of these in Star Trek and Elimination of Bias, because the question is, any thoughts on the exocomps and the quality of life? We are currently living in a society where artificial intelligence is advancing at a rapid rate. I want to say stay tuned, that we can jump into that with more detail, but I do think that's the beauty of Star Trek. And
the courts, I mean, the courts are kind of the area where this is going to be decided. I bring up the monkey selfie case, as we've done a couple of seminars where we compared it to the Doctor and his ability to get a copyright. But the courts recently came down and said a monkey can't own a selfie. But it's not, and it was more we're just not there yet, as opposed to this is it once and for all. So the courts are kind of making rulings, but leaving some openings for future technology, and as society kind of integrates technology.
That raises a very important point. I mean, when we're talking about the exocomp episode, which is a great question, how do you deal with things as they change? You know, when we look historically, I mean, you have technological advances, societal advances, and the law doesn't usually lead the way. The law is typically more reactionary and tries to sort of cure defects and tries to, tries to fill in the gaps when possible. You know, the belief by many is that the leadership or the change should be led by legislature, new laws, political leaders that are elected, and thereby, arguably, certainly giving voice to the people's wishes. So you have sort of societal change, political change, and then the courts. So, if we kind of follow the precedent of history, I mean, exocomps, artificial intelligence, as Angela said, the courts may get there, but we're not there yet.
Thank you. Any other questions? So while people might be typing in others, again, this is still pending approval from the California State Bar. Once we have word on whether or not it's approved, we will definitely let you know. We will have the evaluation come up as a Google form afterwards, and we will also send the official paperwork as well if we do have a positive answer from the State Bar. With that, my hope is to start doing these monthly and being able to pick different episodes and different topics. I do love Godzilla and Universal Monsters, so I have a couple there that I would love to share. And I really appreciate everyone who joined us today for Star Trek Elimination of Bias. And one other question has come in. Okay. Oh, Doctor Who. Yes, that is great. And I did a nice blog post about the effects of regenerations on the validity of wills, and also a bunch of earlier episodes as well. So lots there. But yes, send ideas. Definitely, there's lots of subject matter. We'll be at San Diego Comic Fest at the beginning of March, doing a mock trial with some law students. That's Two-Face suing Arkham Asylum. And if with a little luck, we'll also be at WonderCon. Should hopefully hear from them soon. So thank you all for tuning in. We'll have this posted soon. and really appreciate everyone's time. Thank you all and have a wonderful day.